The history of Sufism in truth had become visible since the life of Muhammad, even before his being prophet. On this video, I'd like to summarize the history of Sufism for 15 centuries, not more than 20 minutes. Actually, Sufism grew and developed together with the growth and development of Islam, starting from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. In fact, before appointed by God his messenger, Muhammad's life had already reflected the characteristics and behaviors of Sufi life. This can be seen in his daily life, full of simplicity and of spending his time getting closer to his Lord. Before the Prophet Muhammad received the first revelation, he had often carried out, which was later known as Sufi activities, uzla and khalwat or seclusion in the cave of Hira for months, until he received the first revelation and was appointed God's messenger. After appointed his messenger, he kept living in simplicity and his time was only used to preach and worship God. At night, he used to sleep very little because his night was used to worship God by multiplying prayer and remembrance of Him. Seclusion of the Prophet in the cave of Hira was the pivotal reference to the Sufis' spiritual practice. Another source referred to by Sufis was the life of the companions of the Prophet related to the steadfastness of faith, piety, asceticism, and noble character. Therefore, anyone who investigates the spiritual life in Sufism cannot ignore the spiritual life of the Prophet's companions that fostered the Sufi life in the following centuries. After the period of the Prophet's companions passed, the second generation of Muslims, Tabi'in, appeared around the 1st and 2nd century Hijrah. At that time, the socio-political conditions had begun to change from the previous period. The socio-political conflicts started from the era of Uthman bin Affan to the Umayyad dynasty. The political conflicts turned out to have a huge impact on religious life, namely the emergence of sects in Islam such as Shia, Khawarij, Murji'ah, and others. During the reign of the Umayyad dynasty, political life completely changed. By a monarchical system of government, the Umayyad caliphs were free to do wrongs. In addition to the prolonged political turmoil, the social condition also changed. This had a great influence on the growth of the religious life in the Islamic community. At the period of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions, Muslims in general lived in a simple lifestyle. When the Umayyad came to power, a glamorous life began to poison the people, especially in a court circle. In such a situation, pious Muslims felt obliged to call on the Muslim community to live simply, ascetically, piously, in order not to be drowned in the cradle of lust. The ascetic lifestyle eventually spread to various places from Medina, Basra, Kufa to Egypt. There was one exception of the ruler who lived with a pious lifestyle. Umar bin Abdul Aziz, who is praised not only because of his virtuous conduct but also because of his corresponding with Hasan al-Basri. Hasan al-Basri was ascribed to be the first ascetic who had laid the first famous doctrine of Sufism, khawf, fa, and roja, hope. During the first 2 centuries, Sufism was none more than an ascetic lifestyle as indicated by the life of Ibrahim bin Adham. Time by time, Sufis started gathering to discuss spiritual and religious issues. One of the first female Sufis considered to have had an essential role in the history of Sufism was Rabi'ah al-Adawiyah. On the hands of Hasan al-Basri, Sufism only seemed like an elevated piety. But on the heart of Rabi'ah al-Adawiyah, the piety turned to be mystical love. Her prayer, 2 ways I love thee, selfishly, and next as worthy is of thee. The selfish love that I do not, self think on thee with every thought. This purest love when thou dost raise the veil to my adoring gaze. Not mine the praise in that or this, yours is the praise in both, I wish. At the time, she was controversial enough. One day, while bringing water and torch, she sought to burn paradise and put down the fires of hell. How bad people who worship God because of hoping for heaven and wanting saving from hellfire. If heaven and hell didn't exist, would you not worship Him? I worship God because of hoping for His pleasure. The favors and gifts He bestows been enough to move my heart to worship God. From Egypt, the nun Al-Misri is considered the initiator of the doctrine of maqamat, spiritual stages that must be passed through by every Sufi. Indeed, the kinds of these maqamat stem from Quranic terms such as repentance, tawbah, resignation, tawakkul, willingness, rida, etc. In addition, it is said that the nun was the first Sufi who introduced the doctrine of gnosis or ma'rifah. The spiritual stages, maqamat, are usually accompanied by the spiritual states. Then the Sufis also formulated what kinds of spiritual conditions would accompany the maqamat or spiritual stages. In fact, fana, passing away of annihilation, and baqa, abiding or subsistence, although sometimes confused about whether these two things are spiritual stages or spiritual states, then arrived at their controversial climax. It is reported that the goal of the Sufis at the time was annihilation, to be spiritually intoxicated. Bayezid Bastami was ascribed to be a Sufi who campaigned this doctrine with the term ittihad. Many ecstatic utterances, shatohat, came out of his mouth, such as "Glory be to me and there is nothing in my robe but God." One generation later, although having written a book entitled Kitabul Fana, Junaid al-Baghdadi, known as a moderate Sufi and not slipped into ecstatic expression like Bayezid, was considered a role model by later generations of moderate Sufis. Contemporary with Junaid, the most controversial martyr Sufi in the entire history of Sufism, whose ashes were said to have been sprinkled into the Tigris River, Al-Hallaj destroyed the building of Sufis, making the image of Sufism become very negative. It was the later Sufis who then clear up the negative image already attached to Sufism. There were Sufis as well as great authors who left monumental works in the field of Sufism. Viz. Abu Nasr as-Sarraj with his book Al-Luma, Abu Bakr al-Kalabadi with At-Ta'aruf li Madhab Ahlut Tasawuf, Abu Talib al-Maki with Qutul Qulub, Abdurrahman as-Sulami with Tabaqat as-Sufiyin, Al-Hujawiri with Kashful Mahjub, Al-Kushairi with Ar-Risala al-Kushairiyah, Abdul al-Ansari al-Harawi with Manazilus Sa'irin, and culminating in Abu Hamid al-Ghazali with Ihya Ulumuddin. In the 3rd Hijra century or the 9th century, the concept of sainthood emerged and was proposed well by Hakim at-Tirmidhi, a Sufi from Khurasan, Persia. In the same province in Khurasan, a Sufi, Abu Sa'id al-Khair, appeared for the first time to establish a formal rule in a khonaqah, a building designed specifically for gatherings of Sufi brotherhood or tariqah. In addition, Abu Sa'id al-Khair is also considered the great medieval Persian poet. Still in Persia, a Sufi who was also a philosopher or a philosopher who was also a Sufi, Shihabuddin Yahya Suhrawardi, with his masterpiece Hikmah al-Ishraq, brought Sufism to its philosophical peak, so that he is considered the founder of the school of illumination with its main doctrine knowledge by presence, al-ilm al-huduri. By his followers he was called Sheikh al-Ishraq, but by his opponents Sheikh al-Maktul, the murdered master, because of accusation of a group of fake experts, jurists, that he was heretic. It is undeniable, according to some scholars, that he was influenced by Ibn Sina via Hikmah al-Mashriqiyah described by Ibn Sina in his work Al-Mantiq al-Mashriqiyin. One generation later from Spain, a Sufi who is considered the pinnacle of Sufism's glory, both spiritually and intellectually, deciphered laws, metaphysics, and the nature of reality. With two nicknames at once, the Great Master, Sheikh al-Akbar, and the Reviver of Religion, Muhyiddin, he was Ibn Arabi. Many later Sufis were unavoidably influenced by his thoughts, so that indirectly the Akbariya school or the school of Ibn Arabi was formed. Amongst them were Sadruddin al-Qunawi,
Fakhruddin Iraqi, Abdul Razak Al-Kashani, Dawud Al-Qaisari, Abdul Karim Al-Jili, Abdul Rahman Jami, Bali Effendi, to mention several.
In fact, Ibn Arabi's influence extended to archipelago Indonesia, my country. Those influenced by Ibn Arabi were Hamzah Fansuri, Shamsuddin Ash-Shumatrani, and many others, which I'm going to discuss on another special occasion for you. Gets back to the Wahdatul Wujud doctrine. The doctrine of Wahdatul Wujud overshadowed almost all Sufis after Ibn Arabi, both from the pros and the cons. The influence of Ibn Arabi in philosophical aspects was indeed remarkable.
Even a Western scholar, James Winston Morris, stated that the history of Islamic thought post-Ibn Arabi, at least until the 18th century, was only a footnote of his thoughts.
In fact, according to the analysis of Islamic scholars, the philosophical doctrine of Ibn Arabi appeared in the poetic forms of Jalaluddin Rumi via Sadruddin al-Qunawi, Ibn Arabi's disciple.
Rumi, when still a little boy, reportedly met Fariduddin Attar of Nishapur, who is famous for his work Mantikut-Toy, the Conference of the Bird. Concerning the idea of the unity of being, it is not difficult to find it scattered in Rumi's poems. Then, despite the fact that Sufism from the beginning could not be separated from poetry, Sufi poets from Persia emerged after Rumi's generation. Amongst these Sufi poets were Sa'di Ash-Shirazi and Hafiz Ash-Shirazi, to mention a few.
On the other hand, on the practical side, practical Sufism also had developments, so that there were many of the Sufi orders that had many followers. It is said that the first Sufi orders that appeared were Suhrawardiya, Rifa'iyya and Qadiriya. Then they were followed by other Sufi orders such as Shadiliya, Maulawiya, Naqshbandiya and many others.
The Sufi orders then spread out to all corners of the Islamic world, especially to the countryside, so that the Sufi orders became a popular religion of the Muslim community in the countryside. It is undeniable that not a few Sufi orders were surprisingly out of control and deviated from Islamic law, Sharia. From an intellectual point of view, the teachings of the Sufi orders made Muslims depend on their murshid, spiritual teachers, so that pamphlet and taqlid or imitation permeated in the Islamic world, and the gates of ijtihad, independent reasoning, seemed to have been closed.
This, the dark age of Islam, lasted since the 13th century, coinciding with the Mongol invasions until at least the 18th century, before the era of Reformation in Islam took place. Because of the Sufi orders, of course not all of them, then by modern Islamic reformers, Sufism was accused of being the main cause of the decline of Islam, especially in intellectual dimension. Even though the Sufi order or Tariqah is indeed a part of Sufism, actually Sufism itself, as seen from many Sufis who have produced a lot of works on metaphysics and spirituality, cannot be put the blame entirely. In spite of the fact that Islam was in its dark ages, there were two significant figures that need to be noted here because of their contributions to illuminate the darkness.
First, Ahmad Sirhindi, a Naqshbandi Sufi from India, launched his criticism of the teachings of Ibn Arabi, Wahdatul Wujud, and promoted the term Wahdatul Shuhud as a form of compromise between Haqiqah and Sharia. He was dubbed a reformer for his work in rejuvenating Islam and opposing the newly made religion of Dini Divine, a sort of syncretic religion, and other problematic opinions of Mughal Emperor Akbar. The second, Sadruddin Muhammad Ash-Shirazi, or better known as Mullah Sadra.
He is considered the most seminal figure for the development of Islamic philosophy in the Iranian world because of having attempted to synthesize all the developments of Islamic thought preceding him, including the idea of the oneness of Ibn Arabi and the idea of illumination of Yahya Surawardi, while elaborating them further to unattainable level.
He was, according to me, a philosopher Sufi, not a Sufi philosopher, because he more emphasized the acquisition of knowledge of intuition, spiritual testing or Zawq as the most reliable force. However, he believed in the use of logical discursive demonstrations.
In the modern era of Islam, as I mentioned earlier, Sufism becomes the main problem of the stagnancy of the intellectual world for Muslim reformers, such as Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdul, Rashid Ridha, and many others who were furious with the attitude of taqlid, blind imitation in the Sufi orders. They dismantled all that, especially the issue of the closed gates of ijtihad, independent reasoning, in order to save the spirit of Islam full of intellectual progress.
Even legally, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in Turkey officially banned the activities of the Sufi orders and closed all tekke places and turned them into museums. Tariqa Maulawiya, or the Mevlevi order, as one of the biggest Sufi orders in Turkey, was also affected. However, as noted by Schimmel in 1954, the Mevlevi order was allowed to return to carry out its activities. The whirling dervishes. In later years, the whirling dervishes became a part of the annual celebration held in Konya in December to commemorate Rumi's death.
In the 20th century, Sufism was known in the West for the New Age movement that looked toward Eastern spiritual traditions, especially Islamic spirituality, Sufism. Perhaps it was the first time for the Western when the term Sufism was mentioned. The first thing occurring to them was Jalaluddin Rumi.
At the time, Rumi was very popular, of course, until the present, because his poems were like an oasis in the deserts of modernism. In addition, what is implied when Sufism is mentioned in the West is whirling dervishes, because since 1971, the Mevlevi order with its ritual performed in London with Khani Karaca as a mutrib. In 1972, the Mevlevi order toured North America. After that, they performed in many places, such as in France and the Brooklyn Academy of Music. In 2002 and 2007, the Mevlevi order got tour orders in the United States.
Sufism, even if having been criticized, especially by the Islamic reformers, still persists because of its being the spiritual core of human beings who believe in the ultimate reality. The term Neo-Sufism proposed by Fazlur Rahman seems to have become self-criticism for the internal Sufi circles themselves. That the spiritual life cannot be separated from the social life becomes the chief point of modern Sufis. Notwithstanding, the social life itself we cannot neglect, cannot be separated from the spiritual life, because human being is not a body that has a spirit, but a spirit that has a body. See you in the comment.